Hey, folks, welcome back. This is Chris in Central Pennsylvania, and a special guest today, none other than a member of South Africa's Parliament, Miss Emma Powell. And we're going to talk a little bit about hopefully her trip to the United States recently. Member of Parliament Powell, Miss Powell, Emma, how are you today?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You don't usually do these sort of interviews, so I appreciate your time. Very grateful for that. So you recently came to the States. There's been a lot of, as South Africans say, controversy, or as we say, controversy, not about your visit, but Solidarity and AfriForum also came to the States just before, around the time you were here. Now, I understand you and Andrew Whitfield, who used to be this shadow minister for police, he's also a member of parliament. You both came to the States and met with policymakers and legislators. Can you tell us a little bit about that trip?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the audience will recall the previous US ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Brigady's allegations around Lady R, in terms of allegations that South Africa had supplied Russia with some form of ammunition or weaponry via the Lady R ship that docked in Simon's Town. And we saw a heightening of tensions between our two countries at that time, very, very early last year. That obviously followed sort of hot on the heels of some of our previous government's dalliance with Russia after their illegal invasion of Ukraine, military drills with China and Russia on the invasion of on the anniversary of that invasion, fraternization with Iran and the Quartet of Chaos or the Axis of Malign Actors. And so the DA initiated about 18 months ago a formal South Africa Washington outreach program where we sought, as at that point in time, the official opposition, to open communication channels with decision makers in the United States to provide credible, fact-based information in terms of essentially our primary goal was to save AGOA. And so when President Trump won the election and was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States, and we then saw the executive order come out in regards to the treatment of farming communities, Afrikaner minorities, and allegations that South Africa was colluding with Iran, we realized that the situation was both grave and urgent because we know that Trump means business. We know that Trump is a lot more transactional than his predecessors, and that the stakes were higher now than they had ever been. And it was in that context that the DA decided that we couldn't wait for the presidency to put together the GNU envoy to go and stabilize the relationship. We needed to get ahead of the noise. We needed to go and meet with people that we have been speaking to for close to 2 years, and try and find a pathway to de-escalate and stabilize the bilateral relationship.
Well, that is interesting. I was unaware that the DA had that initiative going for the past 18 months. Now, you were briefly the shadow minister for international relations when the party was in opposition, correct?
Correct, yeah. So for about 18 months, and now I'm the national spokesperson. So same role, different title.
Gotcha. But no, it is interesting because the government of national unity, I don't know which press reports to believe. It's all over the place. President Ramaphosa keeps talking about he wants to engage the U.S. Ronnie Lamola keeps talking about we want to engage, but then Ronnie Lamola runs around and talks to Deutsche Welle and lies about America's Constitution, saying that we also have expropriation without compensation when the Fifth Amendment expressly prohibits that. You cannot take people's property without compensation. So he's misleading people, but that's going on. It's interesting because I've seen reports that the government is talking about sending a delegation next month. But we're talking 3 months after this issue blew up. That's not very wise. It seems to me that the Democratic Alliance at least is looking ahead and saying, wait a second, this is a dire situation. We can't wait. Someone's got to talk to Washington. That's what I'm inferring from what you've stated.
Yes, so absolutely. We've been conducting this outreach, as I say, for close to 2 years. This was my fourth trip to Washington, D.C., to build relationships with decision makers on both the Democrats and the Republican side of Congress, House and Senate, State Department, National Security Council, the big influential think tanks like the Hudson Institute, the Wilson Center. Um, so we've been building those relationships now for close to 2 years. And essentially now that the DA is the second largest stakeholder in the government of national unity, we've got even more of a stake in terms of really moving the needle on some of the key reform areas or areas of reform that are required or that are being signaled in terms of, for example, a rehaul of race-based legislation to a more means-based approach to address the systemic inequality. Some of the issues with regards to expropriation, concerns around the Expropriation Act. While most countries in the world do have some form of mechanism that they are able to expropriate properties where necessary and in line with their constitutions, we're desperately concerned about the nil compensation clause in the Expropriation Act. Your viewers will, of course, recall that the president did not even notify the DA minister that holds that portfolio about his intention to sign that bill into law. That bill was passed by the previous sixth administration in South Africa when the ANC had an outright majority, but the president didn't have to promulgate the act or the bill into law. When he did, he certainly didn't notify our minister, who's responsible for its implementation, about that. It's caused huge domestic concern and consternation here, concern across the world. The US, the UK, and the EU, the three together make up roughly 70% of all foreign direct investments into South Africa. The US has got 600 companies that have their Africa headquarter operations operating out of South Africa. So there's a lot at stake for the international community. And so, as I say, this was my fourth trip to DC to go and meet with decision makers. We were amazed that this time when we knocked on doors, we knocked at doors at a higher level than we usually see. And those doors did indeed open. So we were able to have some very rational, measured conversations with decision makers from the Trump administration in terms of understanding what they would consider a pathway to de-escalation. My understanding on the delay from the presidency is that I think it's twofold. South Africa is, of course, a sovereign state, and so President Ramaphosa cannot be seen to be sort of bending at the knee or capitulating to the whim or diktat of any foreign leader. I think that's one. And I think that, sort of creating a sense of huge urgency or emergency around the executive order may have been interpreted as weakness. That was one. But two, from a perspective of pragmatism, and one which I must say I support, the undersecretary or the deputy secretary, assistant secretary for state on Africa, on the Africa Bureau, hasn't been appointed yet. And so I believe that the president is consulting in terms of, firstly, waiting for that key appointment to be filled and the Africa Bureau to be staffed, and for the right people to be in their positions long enough to have sort of open, frank, targeted conversations. And then secondly, I do understand via our interlocutors that there's a lot of conversation happening in the background around who are the right people to speak, who are the credible voices, and should members of the business community form part of the government's delegation.
Well, that seems a reasonable approach to this. You've raised a whole number of issues there. I'll try to get through one or two of them here because I don't want to give you a 9-part question. So we'll start with one. The interesting thing about all of this is that you met with Democrats and Republicans, which I think is important for people to understand. And if we go back to February 6th of last year, see, a lot of South Africans and a lot of South African politicians in parliament and all the media in South Africa, without fail, regardless of whether it's a broadcast or a print publication or web-based, they all seem to be telling the same narrative, which is, in my view, not entirely honest, or it's a bit disingenuous. They're acting as if Trump is the person who suddenly has an issue with South Africa, and dating it back to his single tweet in 2018 when somebody got in his ear and said, say something about farm murders, and then he's forgotten about the whole issue since then. But the reality here is that the United States government has been angry bipartisan level with South Africa's decisions against our national interests for some time. On February 6th of last year, a bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans in the House of Representatives introduced a resolution for a bill that would review the relationship with South Africa. And I think that South African politicians, if they don't recognize this, they're being disingenuous and being dishonest with themselves and also kidding themselves. They really need to pay attention that this isn't Trump. It's not Elon Musk. It's much deeper than that. There's deep anger. Ted Cruz is very angry with South Africa. He's not alone. There's Democrats are angry. I won't name them because they can protect themselves politically. They don't want to be associated with Ted Cruz and others. But the point here is that this is an issue that's much deeper than farm murders and then Afrikaners being discriminated against. It's an issue related to, as you've alluded to, Iran, this Axis malign actors from the U.S. perspective, the Lady R. It's the Russian sanctioned airship landing at Waterkloof Air Base. It's the naval exercise with a country that's at war and sanctioned Russia and the Chinese communists. And it's an endless list of things. And I think that if South African politicians don't pay attention to that, we're not going to get anywhere. And publicly, they're not paying attention, maybe behind closed doors. So is that the sense you get as well from your trip to D.C., that is much bigger than simply this, well, Afrikaners being oppressed?
Well, we wouldn't have invested the significant resources we have in building these relationships and having this outreach program if we didn't understand that there's been a problem for a long time. I mean, some of the narrative that's come out of the conferences, the BRICS conferences, for example, around de-dollarization. Firstly, it's infeasible. I mean, they can't peg a common currency because of fluctuations and valuations. The ruble's worth nothing. I mean, it's ironic that in Russia they actually use dollars and euros because their currency is so hugely devalued. But the point is that this is broader than just what Trump alluded to in terms of his concerns around expropriation, farm murders, and the treatment of Afrikaans minorities. There has been, as you say, a problem between our two countries from a bilateral perspective that's reverberated actually to Congress, to key decision makers on the Africa Subcommittee and the Foreign Affairs Committees, both sides of, Senate and House, that I think the Biden administration largely sought to try and really shield South Africa from any real, genuine legislative action in terms of saying that, we passed through the executive renewals of AGOA. We, as the DA, were able to negotiate with congressmen and women at Congress in terms of, continued support for South Africa's inclusion in that act last year. And I think it was largely due to those interventions that we saw it pass again, and obviously Biden, the steps that the Dems took to try and protect us whilst working diplomatic channels to de-escalate and realign. The point being that this is about the ICJ. This is about the instruction by our foreign ministry to Taiwan to relocate their Taipei liaison office out of our capital to Johannesburg. This is about a fraternization with the enemies of America. So whether that be Iran or its proxies via the Hutus, Hezbollah, Hamas, whether that be South Africa's relationship via or under previous Minister Naledi Pandor with senior leaders in Raisi, theocratic dictatorship of Iran's government, phone calls that had been made to the leaders of Hamas, trips that had been made by Fikile Mbalula and Lindiwe Zulu to anti-Western imperialism conferences in Moscow, the same weekend that Alexei Navalny was murdered in a Russian Arctic penal colony, where the DA was at the Munich Security Conference speaking to the leaders of the free world about how we advance our shared values of democracy, constitutionalism, and freedom. This has been a long time coming, right? This is not just about the treatment of minority groups. There was a concerted campaign from certain lobby groups in South Africa during Trump 45 to lobby for the interests of white Afrikaner minorities, not just in the US, but also in places like Australia. And that was where we started to see some of that, what we as the DA, a moderate centrist party, were concerned around the rhetoric that was being driven in terms of narratives of, and I quote, white genocide, or the idea that somehow farm murders were more broadly coordinated, targeted, in terms of a systemic attack on the Afrikaans people, whereas we view farm murders as an abhorrent problem. We've got a watching brief in Parliament, a DA watching brief and an ad hoc committee that we've set up. We've got a rural safety plan that our specialists have developed, but we do see farm murders as more indicative of a broader crime problem in South Africa. Farmers are not the only group in South Africa that has to navigate that level of terror when they go to bed at night. I think if you speak to women and younger that are living in shacks will have to walk in the dark from their taxis. They live in the same amount, the terror is broad spread and it's indicative of the crime problem. So we are concerned in terms of the narrative messaging around the issues that are coming out of the Trump administration, that it's very specifically nuanced and it's not necessarily speaking to the real problems. And that was why we wanted to go and have sort of open up communication channels with decision makers in DC to say, look, these problems are valid, but we've also got solutions and we're working towards implementing our reform agenda from within government. On the issues of foreign policy that have been highlighted, we've been trying to manage this issue for a long time. But herein lies the rub, as Shakespeare said. South Africa are beneficiaries to the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And essentially, that gives us, as a developing economy, preferential market access to the US economy. We, as South Africa, export around about 158 billion rand, or about 8.7 billion US dollars worth of goods to the US. Um, and a huge amount of this is done, about a quarter of this is done under preferential trade access. A lot of the automotive industry in South Africa in places like the Eastern Cape exists because of AGOA. Those industries have situated their African operations here because of the access that they're able to obtain under AGOA. And so that has a knock-on effect in terms of our exports to European markets as well. So an AGOA carve-out will not just harm South Africa US exports, it will harm South Africa EU and European exports as well. It will be our farmers and farm workers that are the hardest hit. It will have a significant knock-on impact for the supply chains that are attached to the industry that exists because of AGOA. So if our nation has as its primary objective economic development, economic growth, and the creation of jobs, then it needs to be our primary objective to make sure that we curry favor and that we have got strong and cordial diplomatic relations with our largest benefactors. Now, the US is one of our largest benefactors, the second largest after China. And of course, when we talk about China-US dichotomy, because everyone says, oh, but China is our largest importer. China imports extractive raw materials from South Africa. The US under AGOA is importing value-added manufactured goods that come with huge supply chains that create jobs. So we have got to protect that industry. Now, that act has got two key stipulations for beneficiaries. And that is, number one, you may not be metering out any egregious human rights violations. Number two, you may not, as a nation, be acting in a way that is contrary to US national security interests. Now, when Naledi Pandor picks up the phone and calls the leader of Hamas, that has just killed over 1,000 people in Israel, and she says whatever she said, there are varying interpretations or readouts of that call. Or when Naledi Pandor travels twice to go and meet with Raisi, or when the Russian aggressors are conducting military drills with China in our ports on the anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or when we take Israel to the ICJ, how is it that the United States, who has security guarantees with Israel, is supposed to turn a blind eye and say South Africa is not acting contrary to our national security interests? So there are incredibly valid concerns here. The problem is that for the last 30 years, we've had a small ANC elite interested in their own party political objectives and advancing their own party political ideas that have dominated the foreign policy discourse in our nation. So essentially, everybody else, our farmers and our industry, have been held hostage by the ANC's foreign policy that has been in their party political interests, not our national interests. So the objective of Andrew Whitfield and I having traveled to the US last week or the week before was to say to leaders, we now have a genuine stake in moving the needle on the requisite foreign policy reforms. Work with us as we work from within government to change this. Don't punish the people of South Africa for the ANC's worldviews.
Well, that's a very interesting comment there, and I think that really encapsulates what the attempt was here from the outside looking in. You're trying to get the point across that look, we get that maybe we haven't been the best actors, but something has changed, and it's a coalition now. Give us a chance to right the ship, as it sounds like you're doing. Look, you brought so many things up there. My other questions, I'm not sure we'll get to all of them at the time we have, but let me get to back what you just talked about here. The thing about the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, you hit it spot on, is that it's a $2.9 billion a year of your trade right now. And it's spawned entire industries that wouldn't exist were it not for that. And it's also value added. It's not just the fact that it's created jobs and supply chain, but it's higher margin stuff. Extractive stuff, sending coal and sending platinum to China is all fine and dandy. But those are commodities, and commodities rise and crash, and they get a devastating impact. South Africa has an artificial advantage over BMW parts manufactured in Germany. They pay 2.5% tariffs that come to the U.S. for those parts, plus they have the highest electricity costs in the world. You may not have electricity thanks to ESCOM, but they have the highest electricity costs. But the reality here is that it's an artificial advantage. It reminds me of the multi-fiber agreement, which expired around 2006, which is an artificial World Trade Organization agreement that allowed for clothing to be manufactured in a third country, the cotton and material sourced from one place, made somewhere, and then they would ship it to Western Europe and to the United States and Japan and overcome the quotas for things coming from Japan and Vietnam and things like that. That spawned an entire textile industry in Southern Africa, which when the multi-fiber agreement expired, completely was eviscerated because most of those companies were owned by Chinese communist companies or Taiwanese companies, and they decamped from Lesotho, from Swaziland, from South Africa, from Botswana, from Mozambique overnight, and over 500,000 textile jobs are lost in Southern Africa because it was an artificial advantage. South Africa has an artificial advantage by being in AGOA. But let me come back to this. The thing about this is, and this is what's frustrating from an American perspective, is a lot of people in South Africa, particularly politicians, keep acting as, woe is me, we're being targeted. South Africa's not being targeted. Trump suspended foreign aid across the planet for 90 days. That included South Africa. Only after South African politicians started moaning did he put a tweet out. And when they responded to the tweet, then it came with executive order. So the other piece of this is that the foreign aid thing being suspended, that's part of it. But AGOA is already on the chopping block. Members of Congress have been talking about, not renewing AGOA for the past year. I don't know if that's going to happen. But quite frankly, South Africa has no legitimate basis to be in it right now. I hate to break the news, and that's probably not news to you, but the mere fact of passing the Expropriation Without Compensation Act into law means that South Africa is not respecting property rights. That is a key tenet of the AGOA agreement. Look, South Africa is a sovereign state. They can make their own decisions, but they sign this agreement to get preferential access into the marketplace and abide by the terms. And the only reason we do this is we get no reciprocity. We don't get no tariffs. That's fine. But we're hoping for good governance in Africa, and that's why it was created. And technically, South Africa is in violation of our law. Not that they're subject to our law, but we must kick them out. And the fact that Trump hasn't kicked, and it's at his discretion right now. He doesn't have to wait for Congress. The fact that South Africa has not been kicked out of AGOA, I think, is a strong message that Trump is willing to come to the table. At least that's my perspective. I don't know if you agree with what I just said, but let me get your thoughts on that.
Well, we know that it lapses this year, so it's up to Congress whether or not there's a renewal or an extension, and then which nations will form part of that. The best case scenario that we're looking at right now, as things stand, is that we can negotiate that government can negotiate some form of an extension while a strategic investment framework of sorts, like the US has with Kenya, or an FTA is negotiated by DTIC, our Trade and Industry Department, and the US. AGOA is looking less and less likely, certainly South Africa's inclusion in it. That's putting roughly $4 billion US dollars worth of preferential exports on the line for South African exporters in rands. That's about roughly 77 billion rand that we'll lose if we see Congress could just let AGOA lapse, or they could negotiate like a 6-month extension, whether or not we'll see a full extension. But I also want to flip it, because whilst I understand that the US has got very valid concerns in terms of foreign policy, expropriation without compensation, here's the thing, right? Is that right now, as things stand, there is no state-sponsored seizure or deprivation of property right now. The Democratic Alliance has launched court action to challenge the constitutionality of the Expropriation Act. We've got incredibly strong institutions in South Africa, and we've got an incredibly strong court system and judiciary, especially our constitutional court. And we have every faith that our constitutional court will continue to uphold our constitution, as was promulgated in 96. And so, in light of that court challenge, as things stand, we're not seeing arbitrary seizures of land. Could that happen if we saw an EFF, MK, ANC stitch up? Maybe. Right now, it's not happening. Number two, the DA has the ministry that's in charge of promulgating the regulations around how expropriations will happen. And that's another safeguard, another backstop. Then on the issue of the treatment of the race-based laws, the DA has a fully costed, and when I say fully costed, I mean essentially that we hired consultants to do a fully modeled cost analysis for an economic transformation plan that relied on using means-based redress to address the systemic inequality. We've got the highest Gini coefficient, highest inequality quota in the world, higher than Brazil, higher than India. The DA's got a full plan, fully modeled, fully costed for means-based redress, where we say it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. We will use poverty as a proxy for disadvantage or as a metric for disadvantage. If you are living in poverty, you will be able to access development, training, and empowerment programs. So we've got a plan to do away with race-based laws. We now sit at cabinet. We didn't get a fair deal. I mean, that's common cause. We got 6 out of 32 positions, but we certainly have a seat at the cabinet table. So we're able to try and agitate for those reforms. Here's where it matters to the US that the relationship remains strong. In the context of the democratic backslide that we've seen taking place across the continent, we've seen it in the Sahel with a number of countries where there have been coup d'etats, a lot of them aptly enabled by Russian mercenary troops, Wagner, or now Wagner rebranded, so the Africa Corps, that's Russia adjacent mercenaries. We've seen the democratic backslide happen in many other elections in sub-Saharan Africa. Zimbabwe is one example, with Emerson Mnangagwa Frelimo in Mozambique. Yet South Africa sits at the tip of the African continent as the most developed and advanced economy on the continent, with the most certainly diversified and largest economy on the continent. We compete with Nigeria, of course, but we're a constitutional democracy that sits strategically between 3 continents, shipping lanes, access to Antarctic, fertile proxy territory in terms of where you'd want your military bases if you were acting strategically to counter certain threats from the axis of malign actors. It is in the US's interests, in the context of the great power competition, for the relationship with South Africa to be strong and cordial. The US imports a huge number of goods from South Africa that they in turn benefit from. And the US it benefits by having really good terms and conditions for over 600 firms here in South Africa as a gateway to the world. So it's not just about what's in the United States' interest from an economic and a security cooperation that the relationship remains cordial. It's in both of our interests. On aid and trade, I've been saying it is utterly devastating that PEPFAR was terminated without notice. I believe that was deeply inhumane. I fully agree and support that it is in the United States' prerogative to put their interests first, to put America first, to determine what works for them and what doesn't. But when you decide to terminate a program such as PEPFAR, where South Africa received billions of rands over many years, we were able to turn the tide on HIV and AIDS because of the generosity of the American people. We received close to 455 million US dollars last year in aid. When you pull the plug on that without allowing African treasuries notice and time to plug the gaps, people are going to die. We're already seeing reports from the BBC that in neighboring African countries, much poorer than South Africa, the people who collect their antiretroviral treatments from clinics are saying, I've got 2 weeks left of my ARVs. The clinic in my village has closed down. My CD4 count's going to drop. I'm going to probably become or move from HIV status to AIDS status in the next few months. There's a possibility that I'm going to die, that my kids are going to die. And I think that that is devastating and deeply, deeply harmful in terms of the incredible work that's been done on this continent to turn the tide on HIV/AIDS. And I think that that's hardened attitudes from South Africa's perspective as well.
Well, I don't think that's unreasonable at all. Having run HIV programs across the continent in multiple countries, established them, rescued the one in Botswana that was failing as part of PEPFAR, and also for the Department of Defense's programs predating PEPFAR, we were doing things in Africa, helping African militaries and civil sector. I agree, that's been very difficult, but the rhetoric has not been helpful coming from South Africa as well. First off, when the aid was suspended, the comments coming from top politicians in the ANC and in the government, well, it's just 17%. It's the Americans don't do much, which is a complete lie. We know that's a lie. First off, there'd be no antiretrovirals if it wasn't for the tens of billions of dollars research done by U.S. pharmaceuticals to create these things. That's completely ignored in this whole process too. That's in the private sector. What is Aspen Pharmacare doing? Not a damn thing when it comes to this. It's up to U.S. firms to do this largely, and a few UK or European firms. But the rhetoric has not been helpful on both sides here, and I agree with you. It's deeply troubling that it was canceled so quickly. But from the flip side perspective, this, Emma, it's the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, not the president's enduring plan for AIDS relief. It was offered for 5 years at $15 billion. We spent $45 billion in those 5 years because Congress loved it, and 85% of that money goes to Africa. And it was supposed to be a 5-year program. We've continued it for 22 years. It's unfair that it got canceled like this. That is definitely having an impact. I agree with that. But at some point, governments have to take responsibility for this sector and for this responsibility, particularly in Africa. Botswana has stepped up and they've taken over most of their responsibility over the years, despite their economic challenges, because their economy isn't growing as fast as it did. But I agree with you. But it doesn't help when we get these attacks. We will not be bullied. We will not be bullied. Now, let me come back to my point that I wanted to get to earlier. South Africa is a sovereign nation, and South Africa is entitled to its position. If South Africa wants to, pass a law that's incongruent, has no congruity with the Section 25 of its constitution, requiring just and adequate compensation and land taken to public purpose, if they want to do that, that's on South Africa. But that does negate AGOA. But here's the thing. It's a sovereign nation, but so is the United States. And politicians in South Africa keep saying that we are bullying South Africa or interfering in South Africa. That's simply not the case. The actions that Trump did in his executive order specifically are things that are in the U.S. domestic interest. So, for instance, when he suspended aid, we were $2 trillion in deficit spending last year. $2 trillion. That's more than 3/4 of the world's entire GDP. $2 trillion, because a lot of small countries out there. That was our deficit spending. It's unfair to expect my grandchildren to pay off a debt 30 years from today that will be 3 times what we borrowed today to take care of antiretrovirals, to take care of counseling and testing, to build testing centers around the world when other governments aren't doing it after 22 years. So I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying you have to understand where the pressure is coming from here. So for South African politicians to say that this is intruding South Africa, I get the impact. It does intrude into the domestic impacts in South Africa, but that's because you've remained dependent on this aid. And so I think that's unfair to say that. And the other thing is the refugee program. We take refugees from all over the world every year. Any year from 30,000 to 150,000 refugees through the refugee resettlement program come into America, and we spend nearly 60 billion rand resettling those people once they get here. That's in addition to what we spend getting them over here. Now, there are 7.6 million Africans currently registered with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Africa awaiting resettlement. Those sitting in Chad, coming from Darfur, those in Uganda from South Sudan, those in Kenya from Somalia, which is the biggest refugee camp in the world. So that refugee program, we do it all the time. The fact that America, we can dispute this because Trump's order is very unclear. It says Afrikaners suffering racial discrimination. In my book, Afrikaners are much broader than white folks. That's, people or culture, that group. And then his subsequent Truth Social, which really doesn't mean anything. It's a social media tweet. He's got to have a policy or an executive order. But whom we allow to come to our country under refugee status is an internal issue for us. Now, I do get I do get, especially if we say farmers, if you want to come to America, that could have a devastating impact on South Africa. So if people want to make that point, but that's not the point they're making. The South African politicians aren't going, you're intruding in our country because you put us in a bind by taking the aid, and now you're going to devastate our economy by taking our best and brightest. That's not the point. They're saying that we're bullying South Africa when I would disagree with that as an analyst. I would say that these are decisions the U.S. has taken in its own interest. It does have an impact on South Africa, but the rhetoric is not helping. And I agree with you. Look, you look very impassioned when you responded there about PEPFAR and what happened, saying it was deeply inhumane. I'm not going to disagree with you. I think that the smarter answer here would have been to say, it's still unfair to South Africa, but you know what? You've got PEPFAR to the end of fiscal year, but we're not going to fund you in the future unless you stop messing with our foreign policy. That's not an ideal outcome, but I agree with you 100% that this was not the ideal way to do this, and it affects a lot of poor countries. So anyway, that's you push back, rightly so, and I'm pushing back a little bit. What are your thoughts?
Well, you and I both have an obligation to act in our nation's respective interests. As I say, I fully understand where you are coming from. The American people need to have their interests prioritized by their government, right? And that's what Trump says he's doing. He's putting America first. I would counter that argument by saying that the aid spending of your government has traditionally been less than 1% of your GDP, and that the soft power that the United States has been able to wield across the world in terms of having an influence over developing the governments of developing countries, specifically African governments, by using aid as a tool for soft power has been immense. It hasn't just been PEPFAR that's been funded in South Africa. It's been all sorts of activities that the American people themselves care about deeply. The United States, for example, has funded many of our anti-illicit wildlife trafficking intelligence operations, anti-land mining operations in other parts of Africa,
Some gender-based violence programs as well.
gender-based violence. That's notwithstanding the US having withdrawn from the Just Energy Transition Partnership. That's a completely different talking point. But if we talk about understanding this dichotomy that essentially has been created through the executive order, that we will provide Afrikaans people with refugee status. About 11% of South Africa's population of 60 million speaks Afrikaans. That is an incredibly diverse group of people from a whole bunch of different cultures, geographic areas, race groups.
Black, white, brown South Africans.
6 million people, right, essentially qualify as Afrikaners. 6 million people. They look different. They have very different cultures. So is it all 6 million people? Because that's significant. And then conversely, 6 million South Africans rely on antiretroviral drugs to stay alive. The US has funded 17% of that. It is deeply unhelpful for our politicians to have said, well, we won't be bullied. Take your funding. We'll find alternative models, funding models, because we've got a fiscal crisis in South Africa, right? We are sort of we have reached the fiscal cliff that the DA has been warning of for years and years, to the point that Garangwana wants to, on Wednesday, announce a 2% VAT increase, right? So we're in a serious financial situation in this country. So that level of, you could say, I hate to use the word, but I do think that that response was arrogant. When I put out the DA's statement, I thanked the people of the United States for their ongoing generosity. I spoke about the ways in which millions of lives had been saved because of the generosity of the American people, how that aid had contributed significantly to strengthening the bilateral relationship and building a strong strategic alliance between our two countries. It shored up public goodwill. I spoke about how the US government's investment into healthcare initiatives, global healthcare initiatives such as PEPFAR, strengthened international security, how it bolstered American global influence. And I spoke about the benefits for the American people of that investment. Uh, Ultimately, I understand that it is up to the US Department of Treasury and Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of State to decide what works for America. And if PEPFAR no longer works for America, then that is their prerogative. What has made me deeply upset, I started off, I'm a KZN girl by birth. I did my undergraduate degree at UKZN, and I ran an organization in Essie Dangeni, the Valley of a Thousand Hills, back in 2006, 2007, where we did testing. We partnered with like all sorts of organizations to do HIV testing. And Essie Dangeni, the Valley of a Thousand Hills, had the highest per capita AIDS rate in the world at that point in time. And I worked with the Gogos and the orphans in that area. And those women were unable to negotiate safety for themselves in terms of the gender dynamics of that area, in terms of the use of things like condoms that would protect them from the contraction of HIV. And so I worked firsthand in those communities. And so I feel hugely emotional talking about PEPFAR because I know what the implications are going to be for the most vulnerable people of our country. And I've had a hard time stomaching this idea that um, Afrikaner minorities are being offered refugee status. But at the same time, it's the poorest people of our nation who could potentially die as a result of this immediate cessation in funding. So I think what would have been a more humane approach to it would have been to say, look, South Africa, we're giving you 3 months notice. We'll continue funding, or we're giving you 6 month notice. I just think that that would have been a little bit more humane. And I think it's as a result of that kind of dichotomy, given our painful past as a country that's really hardened attitudes, where we've now got leaders saying, well, you know what, we don't need the US, this is arrogance, we'll sail our own boat. And so what we're trying to do as the DA, and certainly what I've been trying to do for the past couple of weeks, is to try and say, hey, hold on a second. This relationship works for both of us. Strategic security guarantees in South Africa are really important for the US, right? Preferential market access for South African farmers in the US is really important. Like, where are the adults in the room? And how do we map together a pathway to de-escalation and stabilization that is in both of our nation's long-term trade, economic growth, and security interests?
Well, we're going to run up against a wall here. You've been generous with your time. I don't want to wrap up yet, but a couple more questions before we get there. And that's a question I've been asking throughout this debate. And I've been attacked by people on the far left and not so many on the far right recently, but in the past with my positions, which are right of center, but they're pretty much centrist. But I've especially been attacked recently. So I've been asking the question, where are the adults in the room? I mean, I listened to the debate in Parliament. Gosh, that was long. I could not be a member of Parliament. That would drive me nuts sitting there for all that time. But I listened to Malema and his endless list of lies about America and what America is doing, and his attributing our intentions. AGOA and PEPFAR came from a place of love and generosity. We accrued no value from them whatsoever, other than, as you mentioned, soft power. And quite frankly, having lived in 8 African countries and worked in 38, what we get in soft power oftentimes isn't worth, it's not worth the effort we put into it. But it does pay off for sometimes. But where are the adults in the room? I heard Gate McKenzie get up and try to be an adult in the room, and I missed Athol Trollop's comments, but I heard that his comments were also pointing out the obvious. But so speaking of adults in the room, you were back here. And I want to get to this. One of the challenges when a new administration comes in is that all the political appointees resign. Ruben Brigady resigned. And in interest of full disclosure, he was my boss at the U.S. mission to the African Union when he was ambassador there. I was his senior military advisor. So I know him from going way, way back. But they resigned. And also, there's often a lot of people who are close to retirement in the State Department and Department of Commerce who wind up retiring as administrations change, particularly when it's political party to political party. So that friction's always there. And there's always, you've got to take off. But I think we're dealing in an unprecedented situation because President Trump is moving with alacrity that no one has ever seen before, with executive orders, decisions, constant actions every day. So when you were there, are there enough people even in the room? You mentioned the Africa Bureau, and by the way, my phone hasn't rung yet. I'm waiting to see if I'm getting a phone call for that position. But are there enough people in the room right now? Because Rubio's got a skeleton staff, from what I understand. Did you have enough people you can engage with, or is it going to take time from U.S. perspective to get people in those either staff positions or key decision-making positions to actually make recommendations and advice to the president? Was that a problem, or do you see that as a problem right now, or do they have enough people?
Well, I think you'd be a fantastic appointment. And if not that, we're looking for a new US ambassador to South Africa, someone who's level-headed and who has the kind of experience that you've
Well,
got. So
I
that job's
appreciate
also on offer.
I appreciate the endorsement, but I think Joel Pollak is a little close to the administration, and he's got the edge on that at the moment. At least that's the story.
Yeah, well, let's see. I mean,
Well,
I think we've
my hat is
got
in the ring, by the way, though, in case you're curious.
well, well, I'm not going to say which horse I'm backing. Nevertheless, answering your question, so we were able to meet with the Africa advisors at the National Security Council, as well as the appointee on international organizations. That would be the organization that would deal with refugees and the receiving of Afrikaner refugees in the United States. If that happened, of course, AfriForum rejected that offer immediately. Um, so we were able to meet with people at NSC, and that's of course White House Eisenhower. Then at the U.S. Department of State, we were able to meet with the officials, obviously, that have been at the Africa desk, Africa Bureau for a number of years, but also with the direct political counselors to Rubio himself on the seventh floor. So we knocked on that door, weren't so sure it would open. It did open. Difficult meeting, but we were able to have the ear of people who have the Secretary of State's ear, but not the Africa-specific political appointees. Those are still. We're still awaiting their appointment. Then, of course, we were able to speak to the decision makers at Congress on the Africa Subcommittee, both House and Senate, and on the Foreign Affairs Committee, both House and Senate. We did meet with Ted Cruz's senior legislative director. Some really tough conversations were had. We met with Democrats as well from the Senate side, who are doing what they can. So we met with everybody who's currently in the room on Africa at the moment. I think that there's, whether or not there is even a full staff contingent put onto the Africa desk remains to be seen. Some of what I've heard, I won't attribute it to where I've heard it from, but very well-placed source, very senior source in DC tells me that whether or not there is actually even a full sort of staff contingent appointed on Africa and whether or not embassies are staffed, full diplomatic missions are appointed, to the extent that they were under the Democrats, is looking less and less likely in the context of the great power competition with, once again, um, Africa being this sort of fertile territory for these battles of ideas to play out and the scramble for ideas. Once again, I always reference Samuel Huntington because, Francis Fukuyama had said like it was the end of history and the last man with the end of the Cold War, and in 1989, it was democracy had won, and Samuel Huntington, of course, saying, no, 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 no. What we're going to see is a clash of civilizations, and that is exactly what we're seeing. And that Africa, once again, sort of is a scramble for territory. Um, there is an idea that I'm hearing from people close to sort of the mega maga Mar-a-Lago kind of whisperers that Africa actually is a lost cause in the context of China and the great competition. So what we need is the specialists to kind of come in and go, hold on a second, wait, wait, wait. From a soft power, from a security guarantee, from a military perspective in the context, for example, of the People's Liberation Army and their ambitions for 2049, with this massive Chinese military presence, then the competing libido corridor project, and then the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, all in Africa, bidding for infrastructure, highways. Strong US-Africa relations have never been more important than they are now. So if I can move the needle, and I'll continue talking to decision makers in DC and Washington whisperers on the periphery, Africa is as important now as it has ever been. South Africa, even more so because we are a constitutional democracy and we occupy such strategic geopolitical territory with shipping lanes and military bases, etc. So I am desperately concerned that we've reached this level of deterioration of relations with the Trump administration. I am desperately concerned that of all of the pressing matters that really the adults in the room need to be talking about, we're here talking about farm murders. Farm murders are dire. We have to find a way to fix them. We've got a rural safety plan, but we have got far greater security challenges that we need to be navigating. So my plea to the American government and to the Trump administration is work with us on finding pathways towards de-escalation and stabilization. We are a constitutional democracy. We are proud South Africans. We've got huge challenges. But if the United States abandons us, let me tell you, there are some really bad actors waiting in the wings that will plug those gaps. And the prospects for the future democratic consolidation of South Africa are absolutely dire if those are who our partners are, as opposed to the United States, who by and large shares our vision for the kind of world that it is that we're wanting to create.
Well, I would say that I understand where you're coming from there, and I agree. There's a vacuum there if the U.S. exits, and I would also say that those are already the ANC's partners. They may not be considered South Africa's partners, but they're the ANC's partners, and that's the problem. Also, to the Mar-a-Lago crowd or whoever's out there that's saying these things about Africa's not important, and that the battle is lost. I would argue that we're not competing. Africa has traditionally been a proxy for the greater geopolitical situation, particularly during the Cold War. We saw it play out with the liberation struggles, with the flirtation with socialism in Tanzania and communism across the continent. So it's long been a proxy for geopolitical power. And it could be, and in some ways it is, but not quite to the degree that was between China and the U.S. But the U.S., in my view, has ceded Africa to China. We haven't engaged in a geostrategic position. We've done one-offs here and there. Okay, great, we're working on the Benguela Railway in Angola. That's not a plan for the continent. That's not really a vision for what's going on. China has a vision, and they're executing. The Belt and Road Initiative is one example of that, and they've had that plan for years. Having a 600-ship Navy is something that a colonel came up with in the 1980s, and they're executing in China. This is a long vision. Unfortunately, we're creatures of a short political cycle, and we see that without the vision long term. And frustrates me to no end, because the things I did in Africa, when I did that 15, 10, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, everything was with a 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year vision. Seriously. And I'm seeing those things, fortunately play out in the countries I was in a positive perspective. And I wish leaders would do that. But we're not competing in Africa. We're not with strategic communications, with infrastructure. It's just not really happening. And for a long time, people said, well, PEPFAR and AGOA are a way of competing. Yeah, that's not enough. There needs to be more. So I agree with you that that's a problem. I was going to get this, but it's interesting thing for us because we're going to run out of time here is in the U.S., if the president doesn't sign a bill within a certain period of time, it expires. But apparently that doesn't apply in South Africa because those bills, as you said, were passed for Bella and expropriation without compensation in the previous parliament. They sat on the president's desk for months, and then he signed them later on. So I guess that's a disadvantage from a democratic standpoint because you and a coalition, a new government, couldn't affect change there. I mean, what power do you have to stop the president other than negotiating and convincing him it's the wrong thing to do? I mean, there's no other option, is there?
Well, there is another option in terms of within 30 days of the signing, the Constitutional Court can be approached, but you need the numbers.
Right.
So what the
You want one third of parliament to go to constitutional court. Yeah.
and we don't have those numbers. So certainly not on an act that's more contentious like Bella, where you've got the smaller parties like Brett Heron and Patricia de Lille's Good Party that support it, and a bunch of others that support it. But so what the DA did, obviously, on the Expropriations Act was to launch a court challenge. It was an unnecessary act of provocation, in my view, on the part of the president. We, 10 parties to the Government of National Unity, signed a statement of intent that signaled a reset, a recommitment to respect the Constitution, promote accountability, transparency. Significantly, this is codified to adopt evidence-based policy and decision-making, establish a professional merit-based public service. So when President Ramaphosa, signed specifically the Expropriation Act and the NHI Act into law, it was indeed an unnecessary act of provocation. I think what Ramaphosa is doing there, I'm not an analyst, I'm a politician. I have had some training in analysis, but my role is an MP. And my reading of the tea leaves there is that we've got Ramaphosa is a reformist who genuinely does want to try and make this pro-market economy GNU work. But I think he's facing incredible pressure from the RET faction that's gaining momentum from within his own party. So he's having to balance. Um, and so I think that he's trying to appease the radicals in his own party to keep the GNU intact because he needs those numbers at the NEC, and at the same time work with the reformists across the country to move the needle on South Africa's development. Unfortunately, it was not an act of good faith and it was a direct provocation. What we've really got to watch, and we're not going to have much time. I'm looking at my computer now. Monday night, the budget is going to be tabled on Wednesday, and there is no agreement on the budget. If Enoch Godongwana gets up on that stage on Wednesday at 2 o'clock and he announces anything other than a full public spending rehaul, um, and he moves to announce a 0.5, 0.75, 1% increase on VAT, the DA is not going to be able to support that. And so we risk either collapsing the GNU or the ANC having to go to the EFF. Now, they're never going to go to MK because Zuma will cannibalize the ANC. They know it. We know it. Everybody knows it. But the EFF, conversely, we've seen Ndlozi leave. We've seen Shivambu leave. Their brains trust has left. Julius is the last man standing. His party's electoral fortunes are bleak. It's my personal contention that Julius will sacrifice and rationalize supporting the budget in exchange for a key ministerial position, and that we could see a real crisis from a governance perspective if that happens. So we are hoping that over the next 24 to 36 hours, the negotiations between Ramaphosa and Steenhuisen bear fruit. That we're able to find a middle ground that keeps the GNU intact, that keeps the pro-market forces in this country alive. But all eyes are on the budget on Wednesday. If we can get across that hurdle, it buys us a year. And if we've got a year, Chris, we can start really working towards some meaningful race-based redress, economic reform, and fiscal policy reform. We can start moving the needle on some genuine foreign policy reform. I speak to the foreign minister, I speak to the director general. There is genuine willingness from even within the ANC to start really looking at how we realign our foreign policy to act in the national interest, and we move away from these overt alliances. So there is goodwill from even within the ANC on that. Lamola is a much more reformist minister than Pandor ever was. And I think there's hope on the horizon. We've got to, as South Africa, we've got to get across the precipice in terms of what happens on Wednesday, and then we can start having some more meaningful conversations as they pertain to the United States. As for me and my house, I will continue to do everything possible to stabilize that relationship and to build on the friendships that I've managed to build so far, and that the DA's managed to build so far with our friends at Congress and at the US Department of State in your country. So I think we've got lots of hope on the horizon.
Well, that's a very hopeful message there. I was hoping to save that for the end. We got one more question here before this, but very
Okay,
deep and
shoot.
deep and insightful comments you made there. The next 48 hours could be the most consequential in the post-apartheid era history of South Africa, arguably. I don't think I'm overstating that. And based on what you just said, I think we're in agreement on that. But okay, listen, this has been a very deep conversation. We've talked some heavy issues here, some emotional issues here. Neither one of us have been emotional, but the PEPFAR issue is a very emotional issue. So we've talked about that. But all right, who is Emma Powell? Now, I know we're not asking it about personal things, but I want to ask you, what fuels you? You've been involved with this for some time. You've been in Parliament for several years. You've been with the DA, I think, for 17 years? That's a big chunk of your life there. We're not going to say how young you are. We don't ask ladies that. But what fuels your engine? I mean, I know what fuels my engine. I always want to do what's right, moral, and just, and improve the situation on this planet as best I can. That's been my guide stone my entire adult life. What is driving you? I mean, if you don't mind sharing, I don't want to put you in a spot, but I don't think a lot of people know who Emma Powell is. So if you don't mind, tell us.
Yeah, I'm terrible at my own PR. I have a really hard time doing like social media stuff. So I tend to try and focus on moving the needle in terms of stuff that actually um, delivers results. But I do, as a politician, acknowledge I need to be better in terms of my PR. Justice. Justice is what motivates me since I was a young child. Injustice uh, conjures fire in my belly in a way that I am unable to remain silent in the face of injustice. I grew up in KwaZulu-Natal. I'm an English-speaking South African, um, and throughout school, worked in various NGOs, after school, studied law and political science at university. My stepfather was a veteran journalist, massive passion for African development. And I remember he was the editor of a Continental magazine, and he got me talking about Obama's first presidency, and he got me to write some stuff for one of his magazines and got me really interested in international justice. So I went to study politics and law at university undergrad, honors politics, did my master's degree in international relations at UCT, got involved in the DA as I believe the only real pragmatic vehicle towards South Africa's growth. But I'm deeply moved by injustice. And I think that South Africa is like, I flew home on that United flight 2 weeks ago, Friday night. And when the pilot announced we will be landing in South Africa in just under an hour, I had tears in my eyes because I thought to myself, I have never been prouder to be a South African. We have got so many crippling challenges in this country, but when the rubber hits the road, South Africans, they take hands, they form a lager, to use an Afrikaans term, and they fight and they find a way. And I am deeply passionate about the future of this country. We are more united than we are divided. And I think all South Africans will agree on that score. Yes, we've got massive challenges, but we like the beauty of our democracy is, I think, an example for the whole world. The fact that 30 years after our first miracle transition, when the chips were stacked against us, when we had such incredible rage from both sides of the political spectrum, we were able to find a middle ground with CODESA and the negotiations, and the government of national unity at that point. And then 30 years later, we were able to do it again, is a testament to the resolve and the commitment of South Africa and its leaders to the future of this great nation. Yes, we've got the radical fringe, right? People like Julius Malema who are invested in chaos and destruction. People like Jacob Zuma who want nothing more to loot than to loot for their own private and personal gain. But by and large, the vast majority of South Africans, when the rubber hits the road, I can go walking in communities in Lavender Hill on the Cape Flats, where we've got some of the highest murder rates in the country. And I don't need bodyguards. I can go and knock on doors and I'm safe. I can go and walk through mud huts with some of the poorest people in this nation without bodyguards in Esidangeni in the Valley of a Thousand Hills, and I'm welcomed into people's houses and offered food and tea. Like we are the miracle child of democracy on this continent. And so my goal is to tip the world's axis towards a more just, peaceful, and prosperous place for our world's poorest people. And I know that is going to make me potentially sound a little bit silly, and I need to be a little bit more serious, but that's what motivates me and gets me out of bed every day. And I'm going to keep doing the job that I do with pride in my great country.
No, that's brilliant and appreciate that. At least it's not delusional like Jeffrey Sachs, who says if we all just gave $1, poverty would end. Don't think Jeffrey Sachs understands what the causes of poverty are. People make bad decisions. There's bad systems. There'll always be poverty, unfortunately. All right, so we're going to wrap it up with this one, then I'll give you a chance to get a final statement in here. So the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa, at the moment, it's fraught. What's your sense? Put this in your conclusion, but I want to get your sense of where we're at. How close is the South African ship to the shoals? I mean, is it about to run aground here vis-a-vis the relationship with the U.S.? So the U.S. and South Africa formed a bilateral commission back in the 1990s. Al Gore chaired it. The vice president was so important to us, but that thing seems to have kind of lost weight, or I don't even know if it's still around anymore. You don't hear about it, but we used to do it annually. So just quickly running through the relationship with the U.S. and South Africa, $440 million a year, an average of $500 million in foreign aid. Currently, that's ended, and Trump has given no indication it's going to come back. So that's not good for South Africa. The just energy transition, which in the interest of full disclosure, I'm wholly against it. I think it's a climate religion that people that don't really get how this stuff works, $1.56 billion, that's off the table. That's money that South Africa's counting on to move from coal-fired power plants to alternative energy. The trade relationship averages about 20 billion per year. I think this past year was 16 billion two-way trade, and South Africa has a surplus. That's not good. And as you've mentioned, that's high value trade. I said high margin because you can make much more money off of produced products. You have the entire value chain in South Africa rather than just shipping coal and platinum to China or agricultural goods. AGOA, 3 billion of that duty-free access, which gives you advantage over Europeans and others shipping things in here. You mentioned the 600 U.S. companies are based in South Africa, which is important for us because typically they're based there for operations not just in South Africa, but across the continent. And then something that's often overlooked here, people never talk about, is tens of thousands of South Africans work for U.S. firms remotely in South Africa. It's a huge impact. That's almost never mentioned here. Now, you mentioned second largest benefactor. I would disagree with that statement earlier. I don't think that's what you meant, benefactor. Second largest partner, perhaps, because we're the second largest trading partner of South Africa. But I would say we're the largest benefactor of South Africa. No one else comes even remotely close to the assistance we've provided to South Africa across the board. You know, PEPFAR alone has been $8.1 billion for the last 22 years. So that's the nuts and bolts of the relationship. And right now, it doesn't look too pretty. And you and Andrew Whitfield came here. We barely talked about Andrew. He's been left out of this conversation. I feel bad. I'll have to reach out to him. But so you guys came here and you're trying to make sure that relationship doesn't fall apart. AfriForum and Solidarity said they were doing the same thing. That's played out in the press in a very different fashion. So let me give you the floor. Final comments, final thoughts. You've said some very optimistic things here and shown your passion for South Africa and hoping to keep this relationship going between the U.S. and South Africa. Also, you state it's very important. And I would agree with you. I think it's important, especially for the United States. Africa is not a lost cause. And I've been arguing, one of the reasons I started consultancy to get businesses to invest in Africa, which COVID messed up, it kind of went by this wayside. But one of the reasons I did it is that this is where the growth is at. Africa goes from 750 million people in 2018 to 2.3 to 2.5 billion people in 2050, regardless of emigration. It's going to be that big. This is where the growing middle class is going to be. People with disposable income to buy radios and cars and watches and satellite services and things like that. And if American firms aren't invested in Africa, we're going to miss out on that. We're going to miss out completely. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm concerned about. But anyway, so your chance. I give the floor to you. Wrap it up. Hopefully you got some positive thoughts here. The floor is yours, Emma Powell.
Thanks. Yes. So, I mean, what you've just said. Several international corporations have their African operations in South Africa, NBA Africa, IBM, Microsoft, Dell, Amazon Web Services, Meta, JP Morgan. We've got 180 Fortune 500 companies invested, largest concentration in Africa here in South Africa. We are the largest US trade partner in Africa. We do in total around about 24 billion US dollars in trade. We are heralded here in South Africa as the gateway to Africa. So I think that the message for me to US decision makers is that this relationship is mutually beneficial. There is indeed reciprocity. It is in the United States' interest to keep the relationship cordial with South Africa because, as I say, we are the gateway, not just from a trade and economy perspective, but also from a security guarantees perspective. We are the gateway to Africa and critical shipping lanes. We do have a new government in South Africa. We're sort of 9 months into this new government of national unity. We have managed to, in terms of Section 11.3 of the Statement of Intent, finally codify our commitment to constitutionalism, the rule of law, strengthening of global South-North relations, and the values that the US and South Africa have traditionally held to be sacred values. So we've got more in common than what divides us. I am this will continue to be my message. I think that I am overall positive that we will find a pathway towards de-escalation and stabilization, but that is going to require willingness and concessions on the part of South Africa's leaders in the main, because for our continued eligibility for AGOA access, we need to ensure that we don't act in a way that is contrary or violates US national security interests, and that's perfectly reasonable and understandable, and that we are not party to human rights abuses. Now, the treatment of Afrikaner minorities in this country is being interpreted by the Trump administration as a human rights violation. So right now, we're currently no longer eligible for AGOA. If AGOA isn't able to muster reauthor, or if we can't muster reauthorization on AGOA, then we need to be looking very deliberately and in a targeted manner targeted manner towards strategic investment partnerships and frameworks, or negotiating on an urgent basis an FTA in the Western Cape. I have already said to Premier Alan Winde that it is urgent that he sends a delegation to the United States to start engaging in bilateral state-to-province trade agreements, that we can start, at least from a Western Cape perspective, where the DA governs, plugging some of the holes from an agriculture perspective. I left the United States feeling a mixture of emotions. There is good work being done by the US State Department and a number of legislators, be they both Democrats and Republicans, to try and keep things on sides. Where I am concerned is that we are not necessarily piercing the veil in terms of really being able to move the needle on some of the more mega MAGA Trump whisperers in terms of what's going on in South Africa. So that needs to be an ongoing outreach and project. I appreciate engagements like this, Chris. I said to you, I don't do podcasts because podcasts are often traps. And I said that the reason that I agreed to do yours was because you have such a significant following, and that the podcasts of yours that I've watched, you have always given credible, fact-based, solid, sound information. Your credentials are absolutely immaculate, and that's the reason that I agreed to do this. So I hope that my messaging on this platform that is able to reverberate in the United States is that we understand that change is necessary in this country. We will continue to act in our national interests, but please, will anybody who's got the ear of the people that are close to Trump convey as frequently as possible that it is in the US's interest as well as South Africa's interest that the relationship remains strong and cordial, because there's some really bad actors waiting in the wings, and US isolationism is going to hurt America in the long term. So let's keep building on the relationship, and maybe, Chris, you and I can chat again in a month's time after the budget is passed, and we can see what's shifted then. But thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the kind compliment. I'm very grateful for that. Yeah, I try to be objective about things. People are always talking about unbiased. There's no such thing as unbiased. We all have our personal bias. It's affected by our inculcation, how we've been raised, where we've been. And I'm honest about my bias. I think capitalism is the best economic system, true capitalism. We haven't got it anywhere, by the way. Not even in America is it true capitalism. But true capitalism, supply and demand, is the best system out there. I think a representative democracy is the best sort of political system we've come up with as a human species. Those are my bias. I hate communists. I'll be honest. I don't hate many people, but I hate communists. There's my bias. But you can be biased and be objective. And that's what I try to do, is be objective. And I think I hit that chord pretty well. I want to thank you for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. As you said, as we both said, the next 48 hours could be very consequential for South Africa. Let me leave our conversation with the following, though. Let's assume worst case, okay? AGOA goes, the aid doesn't come back. South Africa, well, hopefully your budget gets sorted out, but let's the relationship with the U.S. Remember, though, something you said, you told to the media, is that, you've seen that the Trump administration is very transactional when it comes to diplomacy. I would say that is the nature of diplomacy, having spent many years working in diplomatic circles. All diplomacy is transactional. Often it's quid pro quo, this for that. But I would say this. Yes, I would agree the Trump administration, the previous one and this one even more so, is very transactional. If, in fact, AGOA goes and all this stuff goes, I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility, if there's still adults somewhere in the room, State Department, in the White House, and in, maybe not in the Thule House, but in Parliament in South Africa, if there's still adults in the room, there's nothing that could stop the U.S. and South Africa from having a bilateral agreement on trade and aid. I mean, that's a possibility. So let's keep that door open if the other door shuts, and hopefully it doesn't. But listen, kia ora. It's been a real pleasure. Bye donkey. I appreciate coming on here. Sorry, I know you're an English speaker. I threw the Afrikaans in there, but the Tswana was also in there. So anyway, Emma Powell, Thanks for answering the questions, and thanks for making the time with us. And I look forward to talking to you again sometime soon. Maybe if I'm on the ground, South Africa, we could have a tea and maybe go into some of those houses in the Cape Flats, where I also have walked through Khayelitsha without bodyguards and felt relatively safe. I was there for the elections last year. I went to 14 polling stations on election day in the Western Cape, 5 of them in Khayelitsha. Now, I went with the Action SA candidate for premier. She was fantastic. We walked around and we met all kinds of people. And by the way, congratulations to South Africa. I thought that election was very well conducted. What I saw anecdotally in the Western Cape, obviously I couldn't get to the entire country in one day, but I thought it went very well. And congratulations to the DA on not losing votes in a very dangerous election year. Actually kind of held its ground. So thank you very much for being here, and we'll chat next time.
Awesome, Chris. Thanks for having me. Chat soon. Cheers.